democracy and democratic institutions. And they came back, and there was a wonderful discussion, and things began to happen. And right in front of us, this has been happening in the case of the European Union. 10 new accession states. And if you take the case of Poland or Hungary is a small difficulty now, but it's not too deep, or the Baltic republics, democracy has grafted. 2 or 3 elections in many cases the country has survived. And this is largely because what happens in each case is when a country wants to join the European Union, there is a detailed negotiation as to what are the minimum demands that the European Union makes. And the officials of the European Union will sit down with the officials and experts of the applying country, work out a detailed program of what changes are needed in law, in judiciary, in labor legislation and all that, and a comprehensive program with clear benchmarks is worked out, and that country is expected to meet those criteria for most of them, almost like taking an exam, and after about 10 or 12 years the country becomes ready to enter the European Union, and when it does, its rewards are plenty. Massive aid, single market, monetary stability, and immense international respectability, and the opportunity to influence the European Union's policy. So great rewards. In return, you have to make this adjustment. And it's very striking that in all these cases, there is no opposition within that country about whether to become democratic or not. No conflict between political parties, because they all know the people are persuaded that the idea is good. All political parties, left or right, are committed to the project, and therefore this begins to happen. And I suggest that if we are really serious about promoting democracy, spreading democracy, we should be thinking in terms of moral, political, economic, cultural, and other incentives, helping societies to create conditions in which democracy can flourish. And I want to end by 3 major points here, because we have talked about civil society. I think it's absolutely right that you can't have a flourishing democracy without a flourishing civil society. But one needs to be slightly careful. Increasingly in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia and Africa, civil society sometimes becomes a substitute for democracy and ends up undermining democracy. It becomes a safety net for discontent. So when people are unhappy, there are voluntary groups, NGOs, that take care of that. So the discontent is not politically mobilized into changing the decadent representative institutions. It's also often the case where civil society groups will provide certain services on behalf of the government. So they become indebted to the government. Or they will provide those services because the government wouldn't. And therefore they absolve the government from its own responsibility. So the point I'm making is that when we talk about the importance of civil society, we must remember that there is a danger if we are not careful. And therefore we should be emphasizing both the civic dimension of civil society and the political dimension of civil society, so that the forces of civil society are used to regenerate decadent representative institutions. We also, I think, should not make the mistake, and increasingly this mistake is being made, is to think that democracy can only flourish in a capitalist economy or a whole package of privatization and all that. Of course democracy needs the discipline of the market, but equally market needs the discipline of democracy, because market has its own casualties, deep inequalities, iniquities. And therefore what we need to do is, while making sure that no government uses public resources as a kind of largesse to give away, which we tended to do very often when we subsidize almost everything in our own country, while recognizing that the government must be subject to the discipline of the market, we must also recognize that the market should be constantly subjected to the discipline of the democracy. Now I think in this context, if one looks at how democracy can be nurtured, the important thing, as I have said, is to make sure that educational and other institutions are able to flourish. Where societies need help, that help should be provided. And particularly, and this I think is very important, if you look at the ways in which societies tend to collapse, having started well on democracy, steady rate of economic growth or economic development is a very important factor. You see, poverty by itself does not undermine democracy. I don't know any country in which just because there was poverty, people say they don't want democracy. On the contrary, the poor are keen on democracy. In our own country, the voting rate amongst the poor and the underprivileged is higher among the poor than it is among the middle classes. What makes the poor, what alienates them from democracy is when poverty is seen to be unjust or avoidable or permanent. And that happens when the government follows policies which are disastrous, which have no hope of success, and which simply end up creating great inequality. And I think in this context it is worth bearing in mind that since economic development is quite important, the West, the rich countries of the West, if they are really serious about promoting democracy, they must commit themselves to global justice. Fair terms of trade, so that repressive societies making transition to democracy are able to export and import and engage in trade on equal terms. And it is also important that not only the regime of trade, but also well-directed attempts to reduce inequalities between the North and South. Dr. Singh, we talked about East and West Kipling. I hope another Kipling of today will write about North and South, and whether North and South will ever meet. And if they do meet, where do they meet? At IIC auditorium or somewhere else? But the point is that this is where I think the issue comes in. That the danger of democratization becoming a new imperialist or whatever kind of project is real. But the answer to this is to see the creation of democracy all over the world is a common human project. Not something that one enlightened country like the Christian missionaries passing it on to the rest of the world. Seeing this as a common project, because democracy has to be created in even the most mature Western societies. I don't need to give you a lecture on how much, if I were in a position of power, I would say to the United States, look, I mean, these are my 12 very important changes, will you please? So that the last election, when the first election at last, when President Bush came in, what are your charge? How is your ballot? You know, why do financial large companies can sway elections? Or why you can't even be a candidate unless you've got $100 million in your pocket? British, same thing. The French, the same thing. Every country. This is why I started with Athenian democracy. I don't know any country where people have a right to decide whether they should go to war or not. In other words, all societies need to democratize themselves, some more than others, but all. Therefore, rather than approach the question in a spirit of arrogance, moral arrogance and spiritual righteousness, what we should say is, creating democracy is a global human project. We are all collectively involved in it. We all have to change in different directions. And if we commit ourselves to a program of global justice, then I think this Western project would be taken far more seriously and would have greater chances of success than I fear is likely to be the case. Thank you.